Hi, and welcome to the Dr. Carl Callender Visiting Writer Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. I'm part of the English faculty here at Brookdale, where I also run the creative writing program. Today on the show, I am absolutely thrilled to be speaking with an award-winning poet whose first collection, Citizen Illegal, is absolutely wonderful, and his new collection, Promises of Gold, was a National Book Award nominee. So today I'm talking with José Olivarez, and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm sure this is probably the first question a lot of people ask you, but Promises of Gold is a bilingual collection, which is rare to find in the United States. And not only that, but it's a bilingual collection where if you read it in this direction, you're reading the poems in English, and it's like a flip. But then if you flip it over, you read it in Spanish in this direction, rather than having them side by side.
Yeah.
So just interested in why you wanted to have, instead of the two separate books, a bilingual edition, and why the sort of flip structure.
Yeah. So I wanted to have a bilingual edition for a few different reasons. You know, first, both of my parents only speak and read Spanish. So to this point, they've never been able to read any of the poetry that I've written, which has some benefits. You know, it's provided me some cover so that I could, you know, write as honestly as I want to about my family. And I often do write about family. But it is also a little bit of a heartbreak that they, for example, haven't been able to read the poems in my first collection. And then secondly, I thought about a lot of the families that have similar experiences to mine. You know, I think about my educational career and growing up, there was never a moment where I could read alongside my parents. If I was reading, you know, I remember reading James and the Giant Peach. And if my eyes got tired, I couldn't ask my mom to read a couple paragraphs to me while I rested my eyes. That, you know, my educational experience was so solitary. And so to be able to write a bilingual edition that students might be able to share with their families if they're, you know, a Spanish-English bilingual family like mine, felt really important and really special. And then in terms of choosing to do a flip cover as opposed to having the translation side by side, you know, I've seen it done both ways. I remember being in high school and seeing like translations of Neruda. And one of the things that I remember about that experience is trying to read the poems in Spanish and having that experience interrupted by English, you know, on the page next to it, so that my brain was kind of, it was messing with my, the way I was perceiving the poems, because I was kind of intuitively switching to English as I looked to the next page and then realized I had to flip it to continue, you know, my experience in Spanish. So what I wanted to do was have it be a flip so that if you're reading it in Spanish, it's a standalone experience. It's not interrupted by the other language. And if you're reading it in English, it's likewise a kind of standalone experience.
I had a student who wanted to translate Neruda. And it wasn't exactly what the assignment had been, but she said, but no, all of the ones you have given us have been so bad and it makes me angry. She's like, I want to compare them, critique them, and then do it myself, which case I was, of course, like, oh, please do that. Yes, I was But I never thought of that if you see them side by side, you've got sort of a critical thinking, how does this translation jive with this? And it takes you out of the experience of the poem.
Yeah, and it might be something where that's like my own kind of relationship with both the English and Spanish language, that if I'm reading, if I see them side by side, I just kind of switch back and forth and have a harder time kind of focusing on the one that I'm trying to focus on. But yeah, I remember that experience. I remember looking at those translations and also, you know, not, like your student not loving the English translations and being like, this is so much funnier, or there's more emotion in Spanish than what I'm reading in English. And so, having that kind of, seeing it next to each other, it took me out of the experience a little bit.
Great. There seems to be so much that's outward looking in that as well, about thinking about how people are experiencing your words on the page and your voice. As a writer, how important is audience to you? Are you writing specifically for audience, with audience in mind?
That's a good question. When I was working on my first book, I didn't imagine that anybody would read the poems in that book. You know, I thought I would sell like 10 copies, like 5 to my family members and, you know, 5 to people around the city of Chicago as I did like open mic events or whatever.
Are we talking about Citizen Illegal?
Yeah. And the interest was much larger than that. And as I started to get invited to do different events, you know, I really enjoyed it, but it did start to like affect me when I came back to try and write poems for what became Promises of Gold. I had this experience where it kind of felt like someone was looking over my shoulder, and I thought about all of the different conversations that I've had about the poems in my first book, in Citizen Illegal, all of the different kinds of justifications that I had, all the kinds of questions that I answered, and I thought about, you know, maybe what was missing from Citizen Illegal that I might want to expand on. And also stylistically, I was thinking about how could I do something a little bit different, as opposed to just kind of write what felt like a sequel to Citizen Illegal. So all those different questions came to me and made it so that I had to work very hard to kind of find that room of silence, so that I could kind of focus and not feel that kind of pressure. And so it took a while, and I tried very hard to think about the audience, but not until later in the process. When I'm generating, I want to try and kind of block that out. Otherwise, I might fall into a situation where I'm simply kind of, you know, repeating some kind of small controversy that I saw on social media or something. And I don't want to be writing poems that are, you know, in conversation with social media or that are trying to go viral in a particular way. I feel like that would create an artificial relationship. So I feel very lucky that I do have an audience, and I feel very lucky that I have what feels like a real genuine relationship with them. But I think in order to keep it real, I have to find a way to kind of protect that creative space when I'm generating new work.
Oh, wow. Wow, wonderful. It's interesting, though, that in Promises of Gold, you also have an author's note that opens up the book, also a rarity. I think that, you know, the poetry world, they think, you know, it's kind of taboo. You're never supposed to explain your work. The poems speak for themselves. And you do explain. You talk about the inspiration and kind of how that evolved. You contextualize the work. It was great. I loved it. I think everyone should do this. But I do wonder, why do the author's note? And what did you hope people would then hear? Yeah.
So I wrote the author's note, but I never necessarily intended for it to make it into the final draft of the book. I wrote it at the behest of my agents as we were getting ready to like go to auction houses to sell it to publishing houses. And so it was really for editors, just to give them some added context about, you know, how it kind of continues some of the conversation from Citizen Illegal, what kinds of departures I was making, why the book is organized the way that it's organized. But my editor, who's really great, Retha Powers, liked the note so much that she wanted to include it in the final draft. So that wasn't necessarily something that I intended from the very beginning to have, you know, kind of preface the book. But I like that it's in there. I like, that's another moment that feels genuine to me, because I was kind of just writing to this group of small editors, and now it's, you know, there for the world to see. I also like it because I started writing poems in the open mic scene, and so it's also a little bit of a rhyme to like when I was a kid and I would go read a poem at the open mic and I'd say, you know, this poem is inspired by, you know, Lupe Fiasco or whatever, right? And so it reminds me a little bit of that kind of nervous ambling that one does before they like share something real and vulnerable.
The book was translated by the Mexican poet David Ruano Gonzalez, whose name I hope I didn't mess up.
No, that was great.
You speak Spanish, though.
Yeah.
So why not translate your own work And what was it like to have someone? I mean, I know there's different, when you work with a translator, sometimes it's very hands-off, sometimes it's much more collaborative. What was that experience like?
So I didn't translate my own work in part because I've never studied the Spanish language. All of my studies have been in English. So there's like a level of mastery of the language that I just don't have with Spanish. Spanish is something that I use, you know, to talk to family and friends. So it feels very intimate, but not necessarily something that I can wield the way I can wield the English language, which is, you know, the language that I study, that I read in. And so maybe one day I'll get to the point where I feel comfortable enough in terms of my mastery of Spanish that I'm able to translate my own poems. But I didn't really think that I'd be capable of doing the poems justice if I translated them by myself. Working with David was a real pleasure. Him and I met because we worked together for a poetry festival, or actually an artistic festival called Lit y Luz, which is like an exchange program between artists in Chicago and artists in Mexico City. And so we do two big collaborative events, one in Chicago, and then we kind of rehash and do a remix of the show in Mexico City. And so when I visited Mexico City, David did translations of poems from Citizen to Legal for me so that I could read them, you know, at public spaces there. And I was blown away by how thoughtful he was with some of his choices. Like, what do you do as a translator? Do you translate the Spanish in Citizen Illegal back to English as a way to play on the kinds of different languages? You know, what do you do? There's a poem in my first book called Mexican American Disambiguation, right? Which is playing with these different identity markers of Mexican, Mexicano, Mexican American. How do you translate the nuances of those different identities? And I thought David had really good answers for all of those questions that I knew would make him a great translator for Promises of Gold.
Which he also, in his translator's note at the start, was that the same deal, that it was something written for editors, or was that always written for a translator's note for the publication?
That was always written, actually, let me think. I think actually that was written for editors. I think, you know, at that point, we had sold the book to Henry Holt, the eventual publisher of Promises of Gold. And I think they wanted to get his thoughts about how he would approach translating the poems.
Oh, it was interesting.
And so he wrote that note. And again, the editors loved it, Rita loved it, and so decided to include it for the public as well.
Oh, I love what he had to say about translation. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we have to take a short break,
Okay.
but hang out with me, and we'll be back shortly. We are talking to José Olivarez, and we'll see you after the break.
Hello, I am here with the president of Creative Writing Club. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing so great. Can you tell me about Creative Writing Club?
It's this awesome place. We meet every Tuesdays during college hour at LAH 101. We have different topics every week, like poetry or prose, all kinds of things. If you follow our Instagram, which is Brookdale_creative, then I post when we're going to meet and what we'll be talking about every week. We also host events sometimes, like poetry readings. And we also host the Visiting Writer Series, which is once a month when an author comes to Brookdale and gives a reading. If you're part of the club, you can also go to dinner with them.
Oh my gosh, so fun. And last question, do you have to be like a creative writing major to join the club, or do you have to write to join the club?
Absolutely not. We want all kinds of people. You don't even have to stay for the full club meeting or come to every meeting. Anyone who likes words is welcome.
I love it. That's so beautiful. Anyone who likes words is welcome.
Unlock your future at Brookdale, New Jersey's #1 community college, with access to 70 programs, competitive esports, and seamless transfer pathways to top universities. Embark on a journey where affordability meets quality. Visit brookdalecc.edu today.
Hi, and welcome back to the Dr. Carl Callender Visiting Writer Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. I'm part of our English faculty, and I am here talking with the amazing José Olivarez about his new book, Promises of Gold. So welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
I wondered if you would share a poem with us.
Yes. So this poem is called Wealth. It's after the poet Lucille Clifton. Wealth. Don't talk to me about wealth. When I got into Harvard, my guys joked it was to mow the lawns. I laughed until I met my roommates and they offered me a broom. If I accepted the broom and beat the cobwebs out of their heads, do you think I'd forget? Now I make poems in languages they can't register. You feel me? In every poem I hide garden shears, invitations to banquets, and they still don't spell my name right. Apologies. When they say José, the only people to turn their heads are me and the janitors, line cooks, waitstaff, yes, landscapers. José el poeta y José the gardener, each of us biting our tongues, trying to make beauty grow from soil covering bones, barely under the surface.
Those last few lines. Wow. Thank you so much. I asked you to read that in part because when I was kind of reading some of the former interviews you did, and this is going back a while, when you were first writing, you talked with the Creative Independent and you said, I never really spent a lot of time writing about myself. It took me a long time before I realized I was allowed to, and that there would be any interest in that. And I wondered if that was just somebody feeling insecure and inexperienced in their writing themselves, or was this a larger issue of somebody who was a first generation, child of Mexican immigrants feeling like there was no place for your voice?
I think the context for that quote was specifically thinking about my educational experience. And, it feels strange. I don't feel particularly old, but, I went through education in what feels like a different era. And when I was growing up, going to school, the kind of model that was in style was a model where the teacher was the keeper of all knowledge and information. And as students, we were expected to receive that information and then just kind of memorize it and repeat it back on a test.
I had that too. I'm older than you.
Yeah. I think that for a long time, that was kind of the dominant model of education. And so when we learned how to write, we were not asked to write anything about ourselves. We were asked to write about the characters we encountered in literature. And because I grew up, the son of Mexican immigrants, because I grew up working class, outside the city of Chicago, there were never any characters that felt like they were a perfect match or even a facsimile of what I was experiencing in my life. And so it wasn't until that first time that I saw poetry slam in my high school, which was a public high school and not a wealthy high school, but had a poetry slam program. We had a teacher, the sponsor of the program, that was really into it. And so I went to one of their performances because it got me out of chemistry class, and I didn't know what poetry slam was, but I was, if it got me out of chemistry class, then I was down to go. And to see my classmates, read poems about themselves, about Calumet City where I grew up, about sexuality, about the war, things that we just never were asked to opine about in class. It was the first time that it really clicked, like, oh, literature doesn't just happen, this is always my example, but in England, because I thought, that's where literature happened, was overseas somewhere fancy. But it could also happen right here. It was happening, in fact, right there in my own school. So that was really the moment where I realized, like, oh, we were allowed to make literature. We weren't just meant to receive it, we could also make it.
So slam really gave you permission. Wow. And so did you start doing slam poetry yourself?
Yeah, so I started showing up, and I participated in our poetry slam club the last 2 years of my high school, so my junior and senior years.
In some interview somewhere, I think you told the story about after that first experience, you went home all summer and wrote lots and lots and lots of poems and spent the whole summer in poetry, and went back to school and showed them to the English teacher, who I think said, "These are really bad.
Yeah.
But I will teach you," or something like that.
That was Mr. Mooney, who was the sponsor, the head coach of the poetry slam team. And yeah, my poems were, he was right, they were really bad. They were really terrible. It was, I was also like a pretty good student. And so it was also refreshing to be a novice at something and to, especially at something that felt academic in a sense, and to be so bad at it and to not really understand it and have to figure it out. I loved it. I love, I think a lot of people get scared when they read a poem and they're like, I don't really understand it, but I love that moment. Because I don't know if it takes me a second to kind of sit with it and wonder, is it my own lack of, knowledge that is bringing me uncertainty in how I face this poem? Is it something in the poem itself? Is it the writing? Is it just not a match? There's so many good questions that come out of that encounter. But as a young person, I was really bad, but I was really committed to the idea. I knew the other thing was I wanted to be a rapper, and I was even worse at rapping than I was at writing poetry. So it felt like there was at least hope for me as a poet, whereas there was no hope for me as a rapper.
Is he still teaching? Do you know?
I do not think he's teaching anymore.
Well, I'm sure he'd be thrilled to see how far you've come at this point. In a different interview, actually, no, my apologies. It was your translator, Gonzalez, who was talking about the importance of naming things, and in particular, naming difference. And he had this great quote, "What exists and isn't named hides waiting for an opportunity to harm." And this resonated with me, and something you had said to the Chicago Review of Books, which was silence and amnesia go hand in hand. And you have poems even that have erasure in them. And then you have other poems I know that you've talked about that kind of rose out of silence. So I wondered, sort of as a writer, where our entire job is in a way to name, what your relationship is to naming and the responsibility of that, but also to silence and sort of a collective cultural amnesia to our own past.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was like 4 questions in there.
Yeah.
Pick whichever one you want to talk about.
I do think it's important to take our job as writers and the responsibility of naming seriously, in part because so often I think about the present moment and the way that our devices kind of quickly digest any new piece of knowledge and turn it into something that is misshapen, and so I think about something like gentrification, right? Which is a big term to name this kind of very urgent and immediate kind of moment that a community might find itself in. But I don't know, when I think about the way that people will just kind of toss it around, I think it kind of misses the mark sometimes in terms of erasing, to get back to the question, right? All of the particulars of what it means when we talk about gentrification. So gentrification isn't just the kinds of moving in and the people that are forced out, but it's also the kinds of loss in terms of like the richness of a community and the way that it gets replaced by, what happens to a community when all of the local shops get replaced by just like a Walgreens, right? When it just becomes like, all of the corporate businesses that already, when the whole neighborhood turns into a strip mall, when it loses its character, when all of a sudden, local monuments get lost and bulldozed, and for like a condo building that, lacks history, that is just kind of being forced there. So anyway, I think it's important take our practice seriously, because I think there's a chance and an opportunity to insist on really looking at the world and taking it seriously and looking at it closely and examining everything that exists, as opposed to just kind of the ways that if you're not careful, you can start to talk with all of the language of a situation, but with none of the real purpose or articulation or intention, if that makes sense. And so for me, what that always means is, like, when I think about writing about my communities, about writing about migrant families, about Mexican American families, it would be very easy to kind of reiterate the kinds of stories that are often told about those communities, and those stories are often tragedies. But when I think about my people, I think about all of the humor that we use with each other. I think about how much we love to laugh and dance and celebrate. And so it would be, I think, irresponsible not to give those stories a voice and to just simply kind of repeat the stories that you could already find about those communities on CNN or wherever.
Thank you. That was one of the things that really, I mean, it's a longer book, Promises of Gold, just in the half I could read. And there are poems definitely dealing with difficult histories, colonialism, capitalism, the poems dealing with masculinity. I mean, this is some heavy stuff, and people have been crushed under this stuff. But it's a fun book. There is so much energy in these poems. There is so much humor, so much music, so much joy. I guess, for kind of, as we wrap up, because this is probably our last question, how do you approach writing something that is political, in essence, without being overly didactic, that is accessible and that looks at the joy, not just the grief?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm always trying to figure that out, and I'm always trying to find an answer for myself, because I want to write poems that feel urgent, that kind of meet the urgency of the kinds of moments that I'm writing in. And I think one of the ways that I found to write towards big political issues that can feel very heavy, that can feel very burdensome, maybe, is to write with humor. I think some people think about humor as maybe like or joy, and they see it maybe as a distraction, as a way not to look at the heaviness that we're facing. But I see it as a way to approach it. I see it as a way to kind of get closer to the truth and the heartbreak of everything that we face, which is, isn't it heartbreaking that, for example, with masculinity, we desire intimacy so much, and we want to be seen and held in all these ways. And isn't it even more heartbreaking that despite how badly we want that, we kind of refuse to name it, to give ourselves permission to experience that type of love, and instead kind of pledge our allegiance to this kind of very shallow way of relating to each other and to the world, this kind of very stone presence way of relating to the world. So for me, the joy and the humor kind of gets me closer. It makes it even more wrenching when you get to the kind of turn or volte in a poem. And so, I think that's something that I've discovered is they don't necessarily, they're not opposed, but rather they kind of walk hand in hand closer to the subject that I'm getting to.
Well, I wish we could keep talking, but it's a lovely moment to go out on. Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been such a pleasure, Jose.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thanks. And thank you all for watching. If you would like to know more about Brookdale's creative writing program, we have classes for enrolled students who are degree seeking and those who just want to take a class from the community. Check out our website, and we hope to see you at one of our readings too. Thanks for watching.